So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Meredith Donovan laughed as she emptied her crystal flute of champagne over Grace's white graduation gown. The sparkling wine hissed against the silk, a cold, sticky weight that bloomed like a yellow bruise across Grace's chest. The country club ballroom, scented with thousands of dollars, worth of Casablanca lilies and expensive perfume, went deathly silent. At the nearby tables, prominent members of the local elite paused their conversations, their gazes darting from the dripping valedictorian to the radiant sister holding the empty glass. Meredith didn't look remorseful. She looked invigorated. She adjusted the strap of her $4,000 Chanel cocktail dress, her eyes shining with a frantic, performative sort of glee. "Oh, Grace, I'm so sorry. My hand just slipped. But honestly, that dress was doing you no favors. It looked like something you found in a hospital basement." Grace Alina Donovan didn't move. She didn't gasp and she didn't cry. She simply stood there, feeling the cold liquid seep through the fabric to the faint, surgical scar hidden beneath her hairline, a reminder of the brain tumor that should have killed her 2 years ago. "Meredith, that's enough," Rachel Miller snapped, stepping forward. Grace's best friend grabbed a linen napkin from a nearby table, her hands shaking with suppressed fury. "This is Grace's graduation party. She's the valedictorian." "Have you lost your mind?" "It's just a dress, Rachel. Don't be so middle class," Meredith said, waving a manicured hand. She turned her back on them, looking toward the head of the table where Douglas and Pamela Donovan sat. "Dad, tell Grace to stop being so dramatic. She's making a scene by just standing there like a statue." Douglas Donovan cleared his throat, refusing to look at his eldest daughter. He adjusted his silk tie, his eyes fixed on the gold-rimmed plate in front of him. "Grace, go to the ladies' room and clean yourself up. You're upsetting your sister. You know how sensitive Meredith has been since she didn't get into that design program in Paris." "Sensitive?" Rachel hissed, but Grace placed a steady hand on her friend's arm. Grace looked at her mother. Pamela Donovan was busy inspecting her reflection in a silver spoon, her face a mask of practiced indifference. Pamela had always resented Grace. She saw too much of her mother-in-law in Grace's quiet dignity, the same woman who had left the family fortune in a trust that Douglas couldn't touch. "Go on, Grace," Pamela said, her voice dripping with boredom. "And while you're there, try to find some joy. Your sour face is ruining the atmosphere. This party was expensive." Grace finally spoke, her voice low and as calm as a frozen lake. "The party was supposed to be for me, Mother. I'm the one who graduated. I'm the one who spent the last 4 years studying while recovering from surgery." Meredith let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "The surgery again? God, you're such a bore." "We all had a hard time during your recovery, Grace. I had to cancel my birthday trip to Ibiza because the house felt like a funeral home. You owe us for that." Meredith leaned in closer, the cloying scent of her expensive Le Labo perfume hitting Grace like a physical blow. "And speaking of owing, Dad already told me. Since you're so smart and got all those scholarships, you don't really need that tuition fund Grandpa Howard set up, do you? I've already used it to book my apartment in the first arrondissement. I'm going to Paris anyway, Grace, on your dime." The room seemed to tilt. Grace looked at Douglas. "Dad, that money was for my medical school." Grandpa Howard was very specific. Douglas finally looked up, his expression one of weak, cowardly irritation. "Meredith needs this for her brand, Grace. You have your books and your little honors. Let her have this. You've always been the strong one. You don't need the help." The injustice of it was a physical weight, heavier than the wet silk of her gown. They had stolen her future to fund Meredith's vanity, and they were doing it in a room full of people who were now whispering behind their hands. The sleeping lion, as Grandpa Howard used to call her, felt a stir of something cold and sharp in her chest. Grace reached into the small, hidden pocket of her damp gown. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, embossed card, an invitation she hadn't told them about. It was the private contact for the executor of the Freedom Fund, the secondary trust her grandfather had hidden from Douglas's gambling debts and Pamela's greed. "I see," Grace said. She didn't look at the wine stain anymore. She looked at Meredith, who was already signaling the waiter for more champagne, her face flushed with the triumph of a bully who had never been told no. "Are you sure about this, Meredith?" Grace asked quietly. "Once you take that money, there's no going back. You're choosing a vacation over my education. You're choosing yourself over your sister." "I'm choosing the winner," Meredith sneered, stepping closer so only Grace could hear. "You're just the girl who survived. I'm the girl people actually want to look at. Now go clean yourself up. You smell like cheap grapes." Grace nodded slowly. She didn't argue, she didn't plead. She turned and walked out of the ballroom, the sound of her heels on the marble floor steady and rhythmic. Rachel followed her, fuming, but Grace didn't stop until she reached the quiet, moonlit terrace overlooking the golf course. She pulled out her phone. Her hands were perfectly still. "Rachel," Grace said, staring out at the dark horizon. "Did you get the video?" Rachel pulled her own phone from her clutch, her eyes bright with a different kind of fire. "Every second of it. The champagne, the confession about the tuition money, the look on your father's face, it's all here." "Good," Grace said. She dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. The phone rang twice before a deep, gravelly voice answered. "Grace, is it time?" "Hello, Grandpa Howard," Grace said, her voice catching for only a second before turning to Steele. "They just spent the tuition money. Meredith is going to Paris, and Dad just told me I don't need the help." There was a long silence on the other end, followed by a sigh that sounded like shifting gravel. "I had hoped they would surprise me, Grace. I truly did." "They did surprise me," Grace replied, looking down at the crimson-stained silk of her gown. "But the lion is awake now. I want to move forward with the contingency plan. Everything. The house, the club shares, and the Freedom Fund. I want it all triggered by Monday morning." "You realize what this means?" Howard asked. "There will be nothing left for them. They'll be on the street within the month." Grace watched Meredith through the glass doors of the ballroom. Her sister was laughing, holding court, surrounded by enablers, blissfully unaware that the floor beneath her feet was already beginning to vanish. "I know," Grace said, a cold, predatory smile finally touching her lips. "I'll see you on Monday." She hung up and turned to Rachel. "Let's go. I have a lot of packing to do, and I don't want to be here when the first check bounces." The morning sun crawled across the hardwood floor of the Donovan estate, illuminating the crimson stain on the white silk dress draped over the vanity chair. Grace Eleanor Donovan stared at it, the dried wine looking like a Rorschach test of her family's true nature. She didn't feel the sting of the insult anymore. She felt only the cold, rhythmic precision of a clock ticking down to 0. The door to her bedroom swung open without a knock. Meredith Donovan sauntered in, still wearing her silk robe, her face a mask of practiced irritation. She didn't look at the ruined dress or the dark circles under her sister's eyes. She went straight for the desk. "I need your MacBook," Meredith said, her voice flat and demanding. "Mine is acting up, and I have to finish editing the Paris-bound vlog before the brunch on Sunday. You're not even using it." Grace didn't turn around. She continued folding a simple cotton sweater into an old duffel bag hidden in the shadows of her closet. "I'm working on my thesis, Meredith. You know that." "Oh, please, your little school project can wait," her sister snapped, huffing as she reached for the laptop. "Besides, after the scene you made last night, you owe me. You practically ruined my big announcement. Everyone was talking about your health scare instead of my flight details." Grace stood still, her fingers brushing against the cold, heavy weight of a black titanium card hidden in her pocket. The Freedom Fund. It wasn't just a tuition account. It was the master key to the Donovan liquidity, a trust established by her grandmother that bypasses the enablers downstairs. The heavy tread of footsteps announced Douglas Donovan before he appeared in the doorway. He looked at Grace with a mixture of disappointment and calculation. Behind him, Pamela Donovan adjusted her pearls, her eyes scanning the room for anything she could criticize. "Grace, give your sister the computer," Douglas said, his voice booming with the false authority of a man who lived on someone else's legacy. "And while you're at it, I noticed your savings account had a bit of a surplus." "I moved $5,000 over to the household ledger this morning. Meredith needed a new Toomey luggage set for her trip. We have a family image to maintain, and your hoarding isn't helping." The air in the room seemed to thin. Grace felt the familiar heat of rage rise in her chest, but she dampened it with the memory of Howard's voice on the phone. There will be nothing left for them. "You took my surgery recovery fund?" Grace asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "It's an emergency fund, Grace," Pamela chimed in, her tone dripping with condescension. "And Meredith's career as an influencer is a family priority. You're just sitting here, aren't you? You're healthy now. Stop being so selfish. You should be grateful we let you stay in this house after that embarrassing display at the gala." Meredith smirked, tucking the stolen laptop under her arm. "See, even Dad knows who the real investment is. Don't worry, I'll give it back after I get to France, if I remember." Grace watched them, the three people who had watched her hair fall out in clumps during chemo and wondered if she'd die before the next vacation installment was due. She smelled the bitter, over-roasted scent of the expensive Arabica coffee Douglas insisted on, a smell that now signaled only theft and entitlement. "The Sunday brunch," Grace said, her voice steady. "At the country club, the one where the board is presenting the Donovan Legacy Award." "Of course," Douglas said, straightening his silk tie. "It's the most important event of the season. Why?" "I'll be there," Grace replied, a small, sharp smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. I think it's time the family legacy was settled once and for all." "Good," Pamela said, already turning to leave. "Wear something that doesn't make you look like a charity case. We have guests to impress." As the door clicked shut, Grace pulled her phone from her pocket. A message from Rachel Miller lit up the screen, documents secured. "Howard has the signatures. The bank triggers the freeze at 9:00 a.m. Monday. Are you ready?" Grace walked over to her desk and picked up a small, silver-framed photo of her grandmother. She didn't answer the text immediately. Instead, she listened to the sound of Meredith laughing down the hall, the sound of a woman who didn't realize she was currently carrying a piece of plastic that was about to become a paperweight. Grace felt the smooth, cold surface of the titanium card in her palm. 48 hours. In 48 hours, the Donovans would walk into the country club as royalty, and by the time the mimosas were served, they would be nothing more than debtors in designer suits. "I'm ready," Grace whispered to the empty room. She reached into the closet and pulled out a hidden shredder. The sound of her old life, the medical bills they ignored, the bank statements they pilfered, began to whine in a mechanical growl, turning the past into confetti. The lion wasn't just awake, it was hungry. Grandpa Howard's library always felt like a sanctuary, a room where the air was thick with the scent of aged cedar and the faint, lingering aroma of expensive pipe tobacco. He sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, his expression uncharacteristically grim as he slid a thick, leather-bound folder toward Grace. The weight of it made a dull thud against the wood, a sound that felt like a gavel striking a final sentence. "It's all there, Grace," he said, his voice a low rumble of suppressed fury. "I had my accountants run a forensic audit on the family trusts. Your father didn't just borrow your tuition. He systematically diverted the funds meant for your post-operative care into a shell account. That account was drained 3 weeks later to pay for Meredith's villa in Saint-Tropez." Grace opened the folder. Her fingers traced the lines of transactions, the cold, hard evidence of her father's choice. Douglas hadn't just been negligent, he'd been surgical. He had watched her struggle to breathe in a hospital bed while he was signing off on wire transfers for lifestyle maintenance. She felt a strange, icy calm settle over her. The betrayal was no longer a feeling, it was a series of documented facts. "The Freedom Fund is secure," Howard continued, leaning forward. His eyes, usually kind, were sharp with a predatory light. "The transition of the primary assets to your name is complete. As of this morning, you are the majority shareholder of Donovan Holdings. They just don't know it yet because the quarterly filings haven't hit their desks." Grace closed the folder, the snap of the leather echoing in the quiet room. "Thank you, Grandpa, for everything." "Don't thank me yet, child," he replied. "The country club gala is in 48 hours. They're planning to use that stage to announce Meredith's engagement to the Sterling heir. They think they're cementing their legacy. They have no idea they're standing on a trapdoor. When Grace returned home, the house was a whirlwind of frantic, performative energy. The smell of expensive floral arrangements, lilies and white roses, cloyed at the back of her throat. In the living room, Meredith stood on a velvet pedestal, surrounded by two seamstresses and her mother. The hiss of a garment steamer filled the air, mingling with the sharp scent of hairspray. Meredith glanced at Grace as she walked through the foyer, her lip curling in a practiced sneer. "Oh, look, the ghost has returned. You're blocking the light, Grace. Move." Pamela didn't even look up from the silk swatches she was holding. "Grace, dear, do try to stay in the kitchen or your room. The caterers are coming for a final walkthrough, and we can't have the house looking cluttered. And please, for the love of God, wear something with a collar. Those scars on your neck are quite distracting when one is trying to discuss appetizers." The insult was delivered with the casualness of a weather report. Douglas walked into the room then, checking his gold watch. The one he'd bought the same week Grace's insurance claim had been denied. He didn't look at his eldest daughter. He went straight to Meredith, patting her shoulder with a beaming smile. "The Sterling family is expecting perfection, Meredith," Douglas said, "and they're going to get it. I've already authorized the limit increase on the titanium card for the jewelry you wanted. Consider it an investment in our future." Meredith squealed, a sound like grinding metal. She looked at Grace, her eyes dancing with malicious triumph. "Did you hear that, Grace? A limit increase. I suppose that means you'll have to wait another year for that community college tuition you keep whining about. But look on the bright side. You can have my old heels if you can find a way to make them look less pathetic on you." Grace didn't flinch. She felt the smooth, cold edge of the titanium card in her own pocket, the one she had quietly intercepted from the mail and replaced with a deactivated clone. She watched her father hand Meredith a piece of plastic that was, at this very moment, nothing more than a scrap of useless resin. "I'm sure the gala will be unforgettable, Meredith," Grace said, her voice soft and perfectly level. "Everything is going to change that night." "Finally, a bit of realism from you," Meredith laughed, turning back to the mirror to admire her reflection. "Now go away. Some of us have a legacy to build." Upstairs, Grace's phone vibrated. It was a text from Rachel Miller. "The legal team has the injunctions ready. The moment the bank opens on Monday, the freeze goes live. Douglas and Pamela will have exactly $0 in liquid assets by the time the first toast is poured. Are we still a go?" Grace looked at the silver-framed photo of her grandmother on her nightstand. The woman who had built the Donovan fortune from nothing, only to have it pilfered by a son who valued status over blood. She thought about the cold hospital floors, the silence of the phone that never rang when she was in recovery, and the way her mother had looked at her scars with disgust. She typed 2 words back to Rachel: "Execute it." She stood by the window, watching the sun begin to set over the manicured lawn. Below, she could hear Meredith shouting at a maid about the temperature of her sparkling water. The arrogance was at its peak, a towering monument of entitlement that was about to be hit by a wrecking ball. Grace felt no pity, only a profound sense of mathematical balance. 48 hours. 2 days until the Donovans walked into the spotlight as kings and walked out as ghosts. She reached into her drawer and pulled out the invitation she had been forgotten for. She tucked it into her bag. She wouldn't be watching from the sidelines. She would be the one holding the pen when the history of the Donovan family was rewritten. The scent of 5,000 white lilies was so thick it felt like a physical weight in the foyer, cloying and sweet, like a funeral disguised as a celebration. Meredith Donovan stood in the center of the chaos, her voice cutting through the air as she directed a team of decorators. She looked every bit the part of the family's crown jewel, dressed in a silk robe that cost more than the average person's monthly mortgage. Grace Eleanor Donovan watched from the top of the stairs, her hand resting lightly on the cool mahogany railing. She felt like a ghost in her own home, an inconvenient reminder of a reality the rest of them had long since edited out of their script. Not there, you idiot, Meredith snapped at a young man struggling with a floral arch. It needs to frame the entrance. If the lighting hits the petals at the wrong angle, the entire aesthetic is ruined. This gala is my debut into the high society circuit. It has to be flawless. She turned, her eyes landing on Grace. The transformation was instantaneous. The professional perfectionist vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated disdain. "Grace, why are you lurking?" She called out, her voice echoing off the marble floors. "And for heaven's sake, stay in your room tomorrow night. I've invited the Miller Sloanes and the Van Dorns. The last thing I need is you drifting through the party like a Victorian waif, making everyone uncomfortable with that sickly energy of yours. It's a gala, not a charity ward." Grace didn't flinch. She descended the stairs slowly, her movements deliberate. "I wouldn't want to ruin your photos, Meredith. I know how much you value appearances over substance." "Don't start with the intellectual superiority act," her sister sneered, turning back to her lilies. "It's pathetic. You're just bitter because the world is finally moving on without you." The front door opened, and Douglas Donovan walked in, followed closely by Pamela Donovan. They were both draped in shopping bags from boutiques that didn't even put prices on their tags. Douglas looked up, his face tightening when he saw his eldest daughter. "Grace, good. I was going to send your mother up," he said, not bother to offer a greeting. "We've had to make some adjustments to the event budget. The vintage crystal was more expensive than the distributor quoted, so I've had to reallocate the funds from your final physical therapy block. You're walking well enough now, and honestly, the family's image needs this win more than you need another month of massages." Pamela nodded, smoothing the lapel of her new cashmere coat. "It's about the bigger picture, darling. When the Donovans look successful, we all benefit. You should be happy to contribute to the family's standing." The contribution was Grace's health, sacrificed for the bubbles in a glass. The rage was a cold, sharp needle in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She simply tilted her head. "I understand, Father," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You've always been so talented at spending money that isn't yours. I hope the champagne is worth the price. It might be the most expensive drink you ever have." Douglas scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "What is that supposed to mean? Don't be melodramatic, it's just a party." "It's more than a party," Grace replied, her gaze shifting to Meredith, who was preening in a nearby gilded mirror. "It's a turning point. You should really take a long look at this house today, Meredith. Take a mental picture of the foyer, the art, the way the light hits the marble. It'll be a beautiful memory to hold onto." Meredith paused, her brow furrowing for a fraction of a second. "You're being weird, even for you." "Just giving you some advice," she said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Some things are too fragile to last when the foundation is built on sand." She turned and walked toward the kitchen, leaving them to their flowers and their vanity. Once she was out of sight, she pulled her phone from her pocket. A message from Rachel Miller was waiting. "The Freedom Fund audit is complete. All secondary access codes have been purged. The Donovans are officially spending on credit they no longer have. The trap is set." Grace felt the vibration of a second text. This one was from Grandpa Howard. "The board has been notified of the leadership change. Tomorrow at 8:00 p.m., the lion wakes up. Be ready, Grace." She leaned against the cold granite countertop, the sound of Meredith's shrill laughter drifting in from the hall. Her family was currently celebrating their peak, oblivious to the fact that they were standing on a cliff's edge. She reached into her bag and felt the embossed edge of the invitation she had taken. She wasn't just going to be at the gala. She was going to be the one who turned out the lights. 24 hours, she whispered to the empty room. Tomorrow, the Donovans would host the most expensive party in the city. And by the time the last toast was poured, they wouldn't even own the glasses they were holding. She tucked the phone away, her heart beating with a rhythmic, mathematical precision. The warning had been given. The fact that they were too arrogant to hear it was their final mistake. The gilded atrium breathed with the suffocating scent of lilies and expensive floor wax. Under the massive crystal chandeliers, the cream of the city's social crop moved like a slow-turning kaleidoscope of silk and diamonds. It was the kind of room that demanded a certain pedigree just to inhale the air. And tonight, the Donovans were acting as if they owned the oxygen itself. Grace Eleanor Donovan stood near a fluted marble pillar, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the invitation in her clutch. She wasn't wearing the faded velvet dress she had salvaged from a consignment shop 3 years ago. Instead, she wore a floor-length gown of midnight navy silk, a gift delivered to her apartment at dawn with a note that simply read, "Dress for the throne you're about to take." It was understated, architectural, and cost more than her father's car. Across the room, Meredith Donovan was holding court. She looked radiant in a blush-pink gown that shimmered with hand-sewn crystals, her laughter ringing out like a series of silver bells. She was surrounded by 3 young women from the junior league, all of them leaning in as if she were the sun. "And then I told the designer, if it doesn't scream Paris, I don't want it," Meredith said, her voice carrying easily over the soft hum of the string quartet. She took a sip of vintage champagne, her eyes scanning the room with predatory satisfaction. When she spotted her sister, her smile didn't falter. It sharpened. She whispered something to her entourage that prompted a wave of muffled giggles before she detoured toward the pillar. "Grace, you actually showed up," she said, her gaze raking over the navy silk with a flicker of confusion that she quickly masked with disdain. "I'm surprised. I thought you'd be at home nursing a headache or counting your pennies. And where did you get that? It's a very convincing knockoff." "It's a beautiful evening, Meredith," Grace replied, her voice a calm, steady anchor against her sister's frantic energy. "I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It's not every day the family celebrates such hard-earned success." Meredith leaned in closer, the smell of her cloying, rose-heavy perfume filling the space between them. "Don't try to be clever. It doesn't suit you. Just stay in the shadows and try not to embarrass Dad when the donors start asking questions. You're here as a courtesy, nothing more." She turned on her heel without waiting for a response, her train sweeping across the polished floor. Grace watched her go, her expression unreadable. She felt the weight of the digital recorder in her evening bag, a silent witness to every word. "She has no idea, does she?" Rachel Miller stepped out from behind a large floral arrangement, her phone held discreetly at chest height. She had been recording the entire exchange. Her eyes were bright with a mixture of loyalty and barely contained fury. "The audacity of her to call that dress a knockoff when she's literally wearing your brain surgery on her back." "Let her have her moment," Grace said softly. "The higher she climbs, the longer the fall." They moved deeper into the ballroom, toward the cordoned-off VIP section where Douglas and Pamela Donovan were greeting the board of the Freedom Fund. Douglas looked every bit the successful patriarch in his tailored tuxedo, his chest puffed out as he shook hands with a local senator. Pamela stood beside him, her face pulled into a mask of practiced elegance, her hand resting possessively on his arm. As Grace approached, her father's smile stiffened. He didn't offer a hug or a word of welcome. He looked at her as if she were a smudge on a pristine window. "Grace," Douglas Donovan said, his voice dropping to a low, warning hiss. "I told you to keep a low profile tonight. This event is about the future of the Donovan name. We can't have you moping around reminding people of the unpleasantness of last year." "The unpleasantness?" Grace asked, her eyebrows rising slightly. "You mean the tumor, or the fact that I had to work 3 jobs to pay for the follow-up scans while you were scouting gala venues?" Pamela stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "Lower your voice. We made sacrifices to keep this family afloat, Grace. You've always been so selfish, focusing only on your own struggles while your father worked himself to the bone to maintain our standing. You should be grateful we even put your name on the guest list." "Oh, I am grateful, Mother," she replied, her gaze shifting past them to a group of men in dark suits standing near the stage. They were the senior members of the Freedom Fund's executive board, and they were watching the exchange with professional, unblinking interest. Among them stood Grandpa Howard, his silver hair catching the light as he gave her a singular, imperceptible nod. The wait-for-it moment settled into Grace's bones. She could feel the rhythm of the room changing. The elite were beginning to take their seats. The waitstaff moved with increased urgency, clearing the last of the hors d'oeuvres. "Douglas!" a booming voice called out. It was the board chairman, a man known for his ruthless adherence to legacy and ethics. "The presentation is about to begin. We're all eager to hear about the new direction of the Donovan leadership." Douglas beamed, adjusting his cufflinks. "Of course, Arthur, it's an honor." He turned back to Grace, his eyes cold. "Go find a seat in the back and stay there." Grace didn't move toward the back. She watched as her father, mother, and sister marched toward the stage like a royal procession. They took their places behind the podium, framed by a massive digital screen that currently displayed the Donovan family crest. Meredith stood at the edge of the stage, looking down at the crowd with a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph. She caught Grace's eye and mouthed the word asterisk, loser, before turning to face the audience. The chairman stepped to the microphone, the feedback whining through the silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we begin our annual toast, there has been a last-minute change to the evening's program regarding the transition of the Freedom Fund's primary endowment." Grace felt her heartbeat with a slow, mathematical precision. She reached into her bag and felt the cold, smooth glass of her phone. One swipe, one command. Douglas stepped toward the microphone, his hand already reaching for the prepared speech. He looked out over the sea of faces, his expression one of supreme confidence. He didn't notice the chairman stepping back, or the way the board members were now looking at their own tablets with expressions of growing horror. "I'd like to start," Douglas began, his voice echoing through the hall, "by talking about the importance of family legacy." Grace leaned against the back of a chair, her eyes locked on the large screen behind her father. The countdown had hit 0. "Go ahead, Dad," she whispered to the quiet room. "Tell them exactly what your legacy is worth." The feedback whine from the microphone pierced the sudden, heavy silence of the hall. Douglas Donovan stood frozen at the podium, his hand still raised as if to emphasize a point about integrity that had died in his throat. Behind him, the massive LED screen didn't show the Donovan family crest or the glossy slides of their charitable foundations. Instead, it glowed with the cold, sterile blue of bank statements and hospital ledgers. The first rage spike hit the room when the audience realized what they were looking at. A scanned check, clearly marked tuition savings, had a bright red arrow pointing to its destination, a luxury travel agency in Paris. Right next to it, date-stamped only 3 days later, was a medical biopsy report for Grace Aliner Donovan with the word asterisk urgent circled in black ink. "Grace, sit down," Douglas snapped, his voice cracking as it echoed through the speakers. He tried to step in front of the screen, his expensive tobacco-scented cologne clashing with the metallic tang of ozone from the electronics. "You're clearly unwell. This is a private family matter that has been twisted by the truth," Grace asked. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The hall was so quiet she could hear the frantic clicking of Meredith's heels as her sister scrambled toward the tech booth. The color didn't just leave Douglas's face. It seemed to evaporate, leaving behind a sickly, gray pallor that made his expensive tan look like cheap stage makeup. His eyes, usually crinkled with practiced warmth, bulged until the whites were visible all the way around the irises, darting frantically from the screen to the silent, judging faces in the front row. A single, fat bead of sweat broke from his hairline and tracked a jagged path through the foundation on his forehead, while his jaw hung slack, his lower lip trembling with a rhythmic, helpless twitch. He looked less like a powerful executive and more like a cornered animal realizing the cage door had been welded shut. In the third row, Pamela Donovan let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her throat to clutch her pearls so hard the string looked ready to snap. She didn't look at the daughter who had survived a tumor. She looked at the board members, her eyes wide with the social terror of a woman watching her pedestal crumble into dust. The witnesses didn't stay silent for long. Arthur Vance, the board chairman, stood up slowly, his face a mask of pure, aristocratic disgust. He didn't look at the screen anymore. He looked at Douglas as if he were something stuck to the bottom of his shoe. To his left, a younger executive whispered, "He let her rot while they were at the Ritz," loud enough for the first 5 rows to hear. Rachel Miller stood at the edge of the stage, her phone held high, broadcasting the entire collapse to a live audience of thousands. Meredith finally reached the podium, her face twisted in a snarl of entitlement. "You're ruining everything," she hissed at Grace, ignoring the fact that the microphone was still live. "That trip was a graduation gift. You were going to die anyway. Why should everyone's summer be miserable just because you were sick?" A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the hall. It was the wait for it moment Grace had orchestrated with surgical precision. The arrogance was now recorded. The mask wasn't just off, it was shattered. Grandpa Howard stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains. He didn't look at his son or his granddaughter Meredith. He walked straight to Grace and handed her a single, heavy vellum envelope. The seal was already broken. Grace stepped up to the second microphone. She looked at Douglas, then at the sister who had valued a vacation over her life. She felt the smooth, cold glass of her phone in her pocket, knowing the final command had already been sent to the Freedom Fund's legal team. "You said I didn't belong in this family because I was a drain on your resources," Grace said, her voice echoing with a terrifying, calm finality. "But you forgot one thing, Dad. This foundation was never yours." It was held in trust for the first Donovan to show the strength to lead it. She leaned in closer to the mic, her eyes locked on Douglas's trembling form. "I'm the majority shareholder now, and as of 10 minutes ago, I've frozen every account you used to fund your legacy. You have 30 days to vacate the house. Security will show you out." Grace didn't wait for his plea. She didn't stay to watch Pamela's inevitable hysterics or Meredith's tantrum. She turned on her heel and walked off the stage. The rhythmic click of her modest shoes the only sound in a room full of people who finally knew exactly what the Donovan name was worth. The air in the marble foyer was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and floor wax, a cold, sterile contrast to the heated chaos Grace had left behind on the stage. Her heels clicked with rhythmic, terrifying precision against the polished stone, each step a hammer blow against the legacy her family had built on the ruins of her health. She didn't look back, but she could hear the frantic scuffle of designer shoes behind her. "Grace Aliner Donovan, you stop right this instant." The voice was shrill, vibrating with a desperate kind of authority that no longer had any teeth. Grace stopped and turned slowly. Meredith Donovan was charging toward her, her face a blotchy mask of crimson and ivory. Behind her, Douglas and Pamela followed like ghosts of a former empire, their eyes wide with the realization that the world had just tilted on its axis. Meredith reached her first, her hand trembling as she pointed a manicured finger at Grace's chest. "You think a little stunt with a microphone changes anything? You're a drain, Grace. You've always been a drain. That money belongs to the family, to the image we've built. You're just a bitter little girl playing dress-up with Grandpa's senility." Grace didn't flinch. She watched Meredith's face, the sister who had toasted champagne in Paris, while Grace lay in a sterile hospital bed wondering if she'd ever see the sun again. Meredith's face didn't just fall, it seemed to dissolve in real time. The carefully applied porcelain foundation cracked as her jaw hung slack, her mouth working silently like a fish gasping for air. The manicured perfection of her features twisted into a mask of ugly, raw disbelief as she looked past Grace toward the lobby monitors, which were still broadcasting the frozen account's screen. Her eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, glazed over with a panicked, frantic light, darting toward the gala guests who were now spilling into the foyer, their smartphones raised like digital executioners. The flush of anger that had colored her neck retreated, leaving her skin a sickly, mottled gray that made her $3,000 silk gown look like a cheap shroud. "It's over, Meredith," Grace said, her voice a calm, low vibration that cut through the rising murmurs of the crowd. "The image you built was paid for with my tuition and my life. Now I'm calling in the debt." "Grace, honey, let's be reasonable," Douglas Donovan said, stepping forward. He tried to craft a smile, but it came out as a grotesque grimace of fear. He reached out as if to pat her shoulder, a gesture of fatherly affection he hadn't offered in 3 years. "We're family. We can go home, sit down, and fix this. You're upset and we understand. We can overlook this little outburst." The audacity of it tasted like copper in Grace's mouth. She stepped back, letting his hand fall into the empty air. "Fix it? Like you fixed the hospital bills by buying a new SUV? Or how you fixed my future by stealing the money Grandpa Howard set aside for my surgery?" The lobby went deathly quiet. Rachel Miller stood a few feet away, her phone held steady, capturing every word. The guests people Douglas had spent decades trying to impress were leaning in, their faces tight with a mixture of shock and voyeuristic glee. "That's a lie," Pamela Donovan hissed, though her voice lacked conviction. She clutched her designer clutch so hard her knuckles turned white. "We did what was best for the family. You did what was best for your social calendar," a new voice boomed. Grandpa Howard stepped out from the shadows of the coat check, flanked by 2 men in charcoal suits carrying heavy leather briefcases. He looked stronger than he had in months, his eyes bright with a fierce, protective fire. He walked straight to Grace's side and placed a hand on her arm. "The audit is complete, Douglas," Grandpa Howard said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I've spent the last 6 months documenting every cent you funneled out of the Freedom Fund for personal use. It wasn't just tuition. It was the mortgage, the cars, Meredith's little excursions. It's all here." He gestured to the lawyers, who stepped forward and handed a thick stack of legal documents to Douglas. The sound of the paper hitting Douglas's chest was the loudest thing in the room. "As of this moment," Grandpa Howard continued, "Grace Aliner Donovan is the sole executor. She has the authority to pursue criminal charges for embezzlement. Or," he paused, looking at Grace, "she can simply exercise her rights as the new owner of the Donovan estate." Douglas fumbled with the papers, his hands shaking so violently that several sheets fluttered to the floor. He looked at the legal seal, then at the silent, judging faces of his peers. The man who had always demanded respect was now a hollow shell, shrinking under the weight of his own greed. "You can't kick us out," Meredith whimpered, her voice small and broken. "Where would we go?" Grace looked at her sister, really looked at her, and felt a strange, cold sense of peace. The rage that had fueled her for years didn't vanish, but it settled into something productive, something final. "You said I didn't belong in that house because I didn't contribute," Grace said, her voice echoing with a terrifying finality. "I'm not your daughter anymore, Douglas, and I'm certainly not your ATM, Meredith. I'm your landlord. And as I mentioned on that stage, the locks are being changed as we speak." Grace turned to Rachel, who gave a sharp, satisfied nod, her thumb hovering over the upload button. The story was already hitting the local news feeds. The Donovan name, once a symbol of local royalty, was being dismantled in real time. "Let's go, Grandpa," Grace said. She didn't wait for their pleas. She didn't stay to watch Douglas collapse onto a velvet bench or Pamela try to hide her face from the cameras. She walked toward the heavy glass doors, the cool night air waiting for her outside. As she pushed through the exit, she felt the weight of the brass key in her pocket, the key to the small apartment she'd rented for Grandpa Howard, far away from the toxic luxury of the Donovan Manor. She had won, but as she looked at the flashing lights of the city, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The family was gone, but the shadows they'd left behind were still reaching for her. She pulled her coat tighter, her eyes scanning the dark street for the black sedan that was supposed to meet them. It wasn't there. Instead, a lone figure stood under a street lamp, watching her with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. "Grace," the stranger said, stepping into the light, "we need to talk about what your grandfather didn't tell you." 6 months had passed since the heavy glass doors of the Donovan Manor clicked shut behind Grace Aliner Donovan for the last time. The city's skyline looked different from the 34th floor of the Freedom Fund's new headquarters. Here, the air didn't smell like the suffocating lilies and floor wax of her childhood home. It smelled of ozone from the morning rain and the crisp, clean scent of expensive stationery. Grace adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, feeling the weight of the silver watch Grandpa Howard had given her for her 24th birthday. It wasn't a showy piece meant to signal status to strangers, but the ticking was steady, a heartbeat of a life she had fought to keep. Rachel Miller walked into the office, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic staccato against the polished concrete floors. She dropped a tabloid onto Grace's mahogany desk with a triumphant grin. On the cover, a grainy photo showed a woman with frizzy, unstyled hair carrying a plastic bag of groceries through a cramped parking lot. "The mighty have truly fallen," Rachel said, leaning against the desk. "I hear Douglas and Pamela moved into a 2-bedroom in the suburbs. Douglas is consulting for a mid-tier firm, but nobody wants to touch him after the embezzlement scandal went public. And Meredith? Well, you can see for yourself." Grace looked down at the photo of Meredith Donovan. Her sister's designer wardrobe was gone, replaced by a shapeless puffer jacket. The arrogance that usually defined her features had been replaced by a look of haggard exhaustion. Meredith was currently working the returns desk at a department store, the very kind of place she used to call a waiting room for the uninspired. "It's not just the money," Rachel whispered, her voice softening. "It's the silence. Nobody calls them. No galas, no charity boards. They're ghosts in their own city." Grace felt a flicker of the old rage, but it was cold now, like ash. She remembered the stranger under the street lamp that night, the private investigator Grandpa Howard had hired years ago to track the money Douglas Donovan had siphoned from Grace's medical trust. He had handed her the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that her parents hadn't just lost her tuition. They had used it to pay off Meredith's credit card debt while Grace was in recovery. "I have to go to the mall," Grace said suddenly, standing up. "There's a document I need to sign at the notary near the plaza." "You don't have to see her, Grace," Rachel warned. "I know," she replied, "but I think I need to hear the sound of the world moving on." The department store was filled with the artificial scent of cheap perfume and the hum of fluorescent lights. Grace stood near a display of leather bags, watching the returns counter. A customer was currently berating the clerk about a stained blouse, her voice rising in a shrill, entitled tone that sounded hauntingly familiar. Meredith stood behind the plexiglass, her shoulders hunched. The scratchy polyester of her uniform vest looked uncomfortable against her skin. She was forced to nod and apologize, her eyes fixed on the counter as she processed a refund for a woman who clearly looked down on her. When the customer finally left, Meredith looked up and froze. She saw Grace standing 20 feet away. For a moment, the old Meredith flickered to life. The jaw tightened, the eyes narrowed with a spark of that familiar, toxic entitlement. "What are you doing here?" Meredith snapped, her voice cracking. "Come to gloat, come to see the peasant at work." Grace didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at her sister with a profound, quiet pity. "I came to buy a gift for Grandpa Howard. He's enjoying the new garden at the apartment. He says the air is clearer there." Meredith's face went through a series of rapid, painful contortions. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking sallow under the harsh lights. She looked at Grace's tailored coat, her healthy glow, and the effortless way she carried herself. The realization seemed to hit Meredith like a physical blow. Grace wasn't the victim anymore. She was the architect of the new world, and Meredith was just a footnote in a history of bad decisions. "We were family," Meredith hissed, though there was no weight behind it. "Family doesn't trade a sister's life for a trip to Paris," Grace said calmly. She turned and walked away, the sound of her own footsteps drowning out the muffled sob that escaped Meredith's throat. Later that evening, Grace sat on the porch of the small, sun-drenched cottage she had purchased for Grandpa Howard. The smell of jasmine was thick in the air, and the sound of crickets provided a peaceful soundtrack to the twilight. Howard sat in his rocking chair, a glass of iced tea in his hand. "You look different today, Grace," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. "The weight is gone, Grandpa," she said, leaning her head against the wooden post. "I realized today that justice isn't just about the fall. It's about the fact that I don't have to carry their choices anymore." She looked at the empty chair beside her. She had won the war, saved the legacy, and reclaimed her health. But the cost was a family tree with severed branches. She was a survivor, but she was also an orphan of a different kind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace pulled out her phone and deleted the last remaining contact for Douglas Donovan. The screen went dark, reflecting her own steady gaze. The shadows were finally behind her, and for the first time in her life, the silence wasn't a threat, it was a promise.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.